David Sanger, New York Times National Security Correspondent in Munich at the Security Conference. It's great to have you with us in the Cipher Brief studio. David, I couldn't help but think that I think 48, 72 hours ago, you wrote a lead for this conference that began "The Great Collision has begun." A great 5-word lead. Now we've had a collision. And I wonder if you can give us, to keep the metaphor going, what's your assessment of the damage done by that collision over the last few days?
Well, it's a really good question, Tom, and thanks for having me back on. The collision happened as predicted. It was one of those things where, you wake up in the dream and you can't steer the car off in a different direction. We saw it coming. I think it remains to be seen whether or not we've got severe casualties here. But here's the sort of rundown as we do it so far. The defense secretary came out on Wednesday, wasn't here in Munich, but he was elsewhere in Germany, announced that when the negotiations take place with Russia, it's clear that Ukraine will not get into NATO anytime in our lifetimes, and that they are going to lose territory, probably everything that the Russians have already grabbed. And so that seemed to the Europeans and the Ukrainians to be essentially giving Putin two of the things he wanted most before they even ever stepped into the negotiations.
Right.
Then he said the United States would not participate in any kind of peacekeeping, tripwire force, whatever it is it's going to be. So that told you that there was going to be a diminished U.S. presence and that everything else was on the table. He was contradicted immediately by Vice President Vance, which suggested they didn't have their positions together. There's a reason that it suggested that. They don't. The administration hasn't really made a lot of decisions, but they got out and spoke to the Europeans anyway. And then they made it clear that the Europeans would not be at the negotiating table and that the Ukrainians may or may not. And we now know that the first conversations with the Russians, though probably preliminary, will take place in the next day or two in Saudi Arabia. And the Ukrainians say they haven't been invited and that there will be no agreement to which they are not a negotiating party. But at the same time, President Zelensky admitted he can't win the war without the United States and probably can't even sustain the war without the United States. So all of the sounds of unity that you heard in this room, in this building, for the past 3 years since the invasion, they all crumbled away this week.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
And to pick up on the last element, David, that you noted, these negotiations are going to begin in a few days in Saudi Arabia, I guess. No Ukrainians, no Europeans at the table, as we understand it also. How has that been, that's just a headline of the last few hours, I believe. How has that been received at the conference, which, as you say, is this whole thing, the gathering you are at is predicated on European unity, and transatlantic unity. How has that gone down in the halls of Munich?
It's been such a mess that we believe that Prime Minister Macron is going to call a meeting of European leaders, not the United States, in Paris to figure out how to respond. President Zelensky, addressing this group yesterday, said that it was a time for an army of Europe to be formed. Well, what is an army of Europe? That means NATO without the United States.
Yeah, that's astonishing. Let me ask you, there are many Trump administration officials. You mentioned Defense Secretary Hegseth was not there, but there are others on down the line who've come to Munich. Have they explained at the conference, publicly, privately, why? Why must the Europeans be absent? Why start with the Russians? What's the articulation of that, if any?
The closest that they came to was Keith Kellogg, who is the special envoy for Ukraine. But curiously, we were told not a member of the negotiating committee for the U.S., said that past experience has shown there were too many people at the table. And when that happens, you don't get an agreement. And he's probably right. He was thinking about Minsk in 2015 after the Russian invasion of Crimea, an effort to try to come together with an agreement that would secure Ukraine. There were a lot of people at the table. It didn't work out very well. But at the same time, your alternative is something that sounds more like it's drawn from the days of colonial powers, where the large powers decided the fate and borders of the smaller powers. And we thought we were all beyond that after World War II, but turns out we're not.
Yeah, I heard you make that reference, I think on one of the Times podcasts the other day, and you also, or somebody referred to Thucydides, right?
I did, yes.
The powerful do what they can, the weak do what they must. Can you explain for our audience what you meant by that reference?
Well, that comes from the Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. And it was a statement of reality. But, the whole post-World War II order was based on the thought that we're going to go past an era of power politics that we saw in the 1800s and early part of the 1900s, that we're going to set up a set of international norms and laws, and the countries will respect each other's boundaries and operate and settle their differences within that set of laws. That is not what the Trump administration has in mind. It's certainly never been what Vladimir Putin had in mind.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're not just a national security correspondent, you're also, of course, a White House correspondent. And I wonder to what extent you can, it's a hard game to get into the president's mind on these things. David Petraeus was on our platform just a short while ago, and he used an interesting phrase that he thinks there's a catalyst for what's going on now is Donald Trump's impatience as much as anything else.
Yes. Is
speed part of the deal here, that we just, like you said, we don't want 30 Europeans at the table, let's just go?
That's right. And speed can be enormously helpful in something like this because he wants to get the war over, and the longer it goes on, the higher the casualties. So there's something to be said for speed. But as we all know, speed can kill as well if you are not careful. And that's the concern the Europeans have, that what you'll end up with is a speedy agreement that leaves the Russians in a position where they could reignite the war after they rebuild, after they put their forces back together, after they recover from the huge casualties that they've suffered in Ukraine, and that there will be no real security agreement to keep Ukraine together the second time.
Mm-hmm. And the Europeans, who I believe it was Mike Waltz the other day, who said, the National Security Advisor, that they should own this conflict. So they're not at the table, but ultimately, I guess after whatever happens, is that how we should read that?
The way the Europeans are reading it is they don't want us in on the negotiations, but whatever they come up with, they want European forces there to enforce.
Right. Last question then, in a way you've answered it, David, but in terms of the U.S.-European relationship and the world order you've just described, you write first drafts of history, not history, but do you think it's hyperbole at this point to think that these last few days, this week, might be looked back on as a kind of, at least the beginning of a rewriting of the transatlantic and European order?
It could certainly be that. We try for first drafts, and in my books, I try for second drafts. I don't think any of us are going to live long enough here to do the third draft, and the one that probably counts, because I think this is going to drag on for some time. But Donald Trump has made clear he doesn't want to go deal with the European Union. He doesn't want to deal with NATO. He wants to deal with individual countries. And that means that he wants to make the most of his power relationship. Europe is at its most powerful when it is united. It's at its least powerful when it's split apart. Trump would be perfectly happy to keep it on its back heels here. And he's not out of that group, which Joe Biden came from, John Kennedy came from, actually most recent modern presidents have come from, which have viewed our alliances as a strength and a way to extend American power. He views them as an expensive impediment.
Yeah. We'll leave it there. David Sanger, New York Times national security correspondent and White House correspondent, and your insights are always appreciated. Thanks for being with us at the Cipher.
Thanks. Great to be with you.